Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest Edinburgh World Heritage in conversation tonight with a group of Edinburgh's esteemed and senior journalists, so I'm delighted to welcome them. As you know, this is a series of online conversations where we're discussing some of the issues the city is facing, both during and after the coronavirus lockdown. After recent events with architects in May and politicians just a few weeks ago, I'm really delighted to welcome our group of esteemed journalists and editors to discuss the state of the press and of the media in Edinburgh and Scotland, as well as the health of our local democracy in the city. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. You won't be able to unmute yourselves during the evening or turn on your camera. This is to allow us to ensure that the cameras and audio are focused on the hosts and guests. However, we'd like you very much to take part, and we're looking for questions from the floor during the evening. So if you have something you'd like to put to our guests or make a comment about anything you're hearing, please do so by using the Q&A function, which you should just be able to open from the beam along the bottom. My colleague Barbara will be moderating what's coming in, and we do have moderating rules, and you can see those up on the screen now. In terms of tech support, if you're having any technical issues, let us know using the chat window, not the Q&A window, and we will do our best to accommodate you. And our colleague Kay is on hand to help with any technical issues. By the way, tonight we are using an upgraded version of Zoom, the software, to allow us to reach more people. And this was very generously donated to Edinburgh World Heritage by our friend Jerry Ozaniak. So thanks to him. The event is also being recorded so that you will be able to catch up and see what's happening afterwards, or people that aren't able to tune in this evening. So that will be publicised via our normal social media channels over the next couple of days. So with that, over to my co-host for this evening, Becky.
Thank you. So as everyone will be aware, the coronavirus outbreak is having a major impact on many charities in the UK and around the world. And quite apart from the human cost of the disease, the pandemic is also causing a significant financial impact, which threatens the crucial work of many charities. At Edinburgh World Heritage, fundraising events have been cancelled. Our World Heritage exhibition and retail operation at the Tron has been closed, and important conservation work has had to be paused. As a result, we expect to lose an important part of our income this year. And while we will make every effort to cut our cloth, the reality is that, like others, we face a significant financial shortfall. So we're therefore asking our friends and supporters this evening to help us get through this period of uncertainty. If you support our conservation and community work in Edinburgh, please consider becoming one of our supporters tonight. We've made this very easy for you, as you'll be able to see. Just text the word Edinburgh WH with the amount you want to donate to 70450. If you'd like to donate £10, for example, then text Edinburgh WH10 to 70450. That's Edinburgh WH10 to 70450. And if you'd like to become a member and support our conservation work in the city, please go to the members section of our website, ewh.org.uk. And now back to Nick.
Thank you, Becky. Great. So time to introduce our guests tonight. Not including a 6-year spell as a paperboy, Euan McGrory has worked in newspapers and on news websites for more than 25 years. A father of 2, he lives in Edinburgh, where he enjoys walking, cycling and playing footy. In his professional life, he is a former Investigative Journalist of the Year and was named UK Journalist of the Year by the charity Mind for uncovering the NHS practice of burying some mental health patients who died in their care in unmarked graves. Before taking up his current role in March 2020, he spent 3 years editing the Edinburgh Evening News, during which time the title achieved record readership levels driven by digital page views of 30 million a month. As print editor of Scotland, Euan oversees publication of the Scotsman, the Edinburgh Evening News, Scotland on Sunday, the Falkirk Herald and the Fife Free Press. David Bol has worked as a reporter and digital editor for a range of local news titles in the southwest of England and has freelanced for the news desk on both the Scotsman and the Edinburgh Evening News. He started his current role earlier this year, having spent almost 2 years as local democracy reporter covering City of Edinburgh Council, where I'm sure many of you will have come across his reporting, both on social media and for the evening news. He's also worked for the BBC and other media outlets. And it was during this time, as local democracy reporter, that he was shortlisted for Political Journalist of the Year at the Scottish Press Awards. David is currently political correspondent for the Herald.
Edinburgh-born Phyllis Stephen has spent most of her life here in the capital, where she now lives and works as a journalist. In 2010, she founded the Edinburgh Reporter, the independent news publisher, which aims to tell the news with a straight-to-bat approach. As well as the popular news website updated on a daily basis, the Edinburgh Reporter also has a monthly print edition. On top of all of this, the publication also produces podcasts called the Edinburgh Report. Phyllis loves taking photographs and making video reports and is an avid member of the mobile journalism movement. Her favourite view of Edinburgh, as I'm sure many of ours is from Calton Hill, with the view from the Castle Esplanade a very close second. During this difficult lockdown period, she has loved cycling and walking on the empty city centre streets. Mure Dickie is the Scotland correspondent for the Financial Times, but has spent most of his career in the Far East. Before joining the FT, he worked for Reuters news agency in Beijing and Tokyo. From 1999 to 2003, Mure was the FT's Taipei correspondent, where he reported on the deadly 1999 earthquake and the island's first democratic transfer of power in 2000. Then from 2003 to 2008, he was the FT's Beijing correspondent, covering a range of stories that included the SARS epidemic, China's emergence as a technology powerhouse, and the highs and lows of the Beijing Olympics. He was then the FT Tokyo bureau chief, responsible for leading coverage of the world's third largest economy during the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster. Mure is an impressive linguist and speaks Chinese and Japanese, as well as his native Scots. He is also a student of Kendo, the Japanese art of fencing, in which he holds the 4th Dan grade. So welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for agreeing to join us this evening.
So just a reminder to everyone to get your questions coming in on the Q&A. We expect our journalists to be very succinct in their answers, as that's their stock in trade, so we can get through quite a lot of coverage this evening and lots of topics. So the COVID-19 pandemic has changed so much in Edinburgh and will continue to do so for some time to come. This evening, we'd like to focus on how the city's run, on the impact of the pandemic on local democracy, as well as the crucial role the press plays in covering local politics and holding everyone, including Edinburgh World Heritage, to account. The concern here is that the combination of the pandemic, inevitable pressures at city chambers, and a weakened local press all add up to a major threat to local democracy. So I'll start by asking the team to think about a broad question to assess the overall health of the press in Edinburgh and Scotland. And I'm going to start by asking Euan to answer that. Over to you, Euan.
In a word, I would say precarious, especially when you look across Scotland as a whole. We've seen newspapers shut down already during the crisis. Some certainly won't survive. I think in Edinburgh, where there are more bigger titles, it's not, we're not likely to see closures, but what they will look like next year, the year after, still very much to play for. We've heard already this evening about how badly hit charities have been. The papers are one of the other areas that have been particularly badly hit. Our advertising's gone dramatically down. We don't know how quickly that will pick up. So these are challenging times.
And Phyllis, what about from your perspective and the Edinburgh Reporter?
Yeah, I think I'm perhaps always a lot more optimistic. So forgive me, Euan. I don't think I would, say it's precarious, but I do think it's time that newspapers grab the digital world by the whatevers, and really get to grips with that, because that makes a difference and it can cut costs. I mean, if we don't have an office as such, and I know that all the JPI media titles do, so I suppose there are costs there too. I know you don't during the lockdown, but there are costs there which can be cut.
Before, but yeah.
You don't have an office anymore?
Don't all have offices. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Phyllis, are you saying that the media in Edinburgh, the Scottish media, needs to move more quickly in terms of embracing digital?
Well, no, I just think that, everybody, here you are, Nick, you are here online, and previous to the lockdown, I don't suppose you thought about doing things like this. So I just think we have to view it as an opportunity, perhaps, rather than all bad. And I think that the major thing for everyone, and you rightly touched on it, Euan, is lack of advertising. And, our advertisers have run for the hills, but and we're still waiting for the Scottish government. But, I do think it's time to get creative.
Mure,
over to you. From the esteemed heights of the Financial Times, how are you viewing the media in Scotland in terms of its health?
Well, there's a lot of good journalism done in Scotland. There's a lot. Every time I read a paper, whether it's Evening News or the Scotsman or any of the other papers across the country, I always can learn something. But there's no question that the disaster that has hit the conventional newspaper business model over the last 20 years has had a huge impact here. And it's actually the FT, I was reading today in the FT a story from the United States about local and regional press, and it had a quite startling a statistic that puts into context just how much of a problem basically the collapse over time of advertising revenues for papers has been. It says that in 2000, newspapers and magazines accounted for about half of all advertising spending in the world. That market's now worth about $530 billion, but newspapers and magazines have only 10% of it. So right. The role of particularly companies like Google and Facebook in just scooping up the money that used to be spent through papers has just had a massive impact. And anybody who can remember, I'm too young, of course, but the days when even relatively small papers could rely on a large staff, could staff routine press conferences for at a city level, could carve people out to concentrate on difficult projects for weeks on end. It becomes impossible if you don't have the money. And I think that's almost amazing how well newspapers and journalists do given those extraordinary constraints.
Right. And David, maybe reflect also on that point that Mure's made in terms of the impact of social media in taking away revenue from the press. Is that something you're seeing at the Herald as well, or is that an issue?
Yeah, I think that's across the industry really, with Google and Facebook basically having the monopoly share of online advertising. Newspapers are converting more to digital, which is fine, but the money still comes in from print titles. So until that business model changes across the industry, that is going to be a big impact. And Euan's completely right. The situation is pretty dire for the whole industry, with advertisers not being able to advertise essentially, and also circulations during this pandemic down because a lot of shops simply aren't open. So yes, I think Phyllis is right. We do have to look more at digital, but it's making that a sustainable business model that's important.
I think it would be true to say that, sorry, Euan, I think it would be true to say that, all these things were happening anyway to the newspaper industry. Ad sales were falling, print sales have fallen by 69% in 10 years and things, with massive numbers. So I guess it's probably just brought these problems to a more acute place.
We're going to, sorry, Euan.
I was just going to agree with Phyllis. I think what it's done has vastly accelerated trends that were there already. And we've been seeing, with our titles, fast-growing digital audiences for a few years and declining print ones. I think that's quite typical. During the pandemic, we have seen absolutely enormous increases in our digital audience. There was a PAMCO report out last week that showed almost more than doubled our audience. So, in March, we had more than 50 million articles read on our two main websites. That's just staggering levels of interest as people are looking for sources of trusted news. But we're making a lot less money.
Yeah, and it would be interesting, just sort of building on that point in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had. It's obviously accelerated some of the issues, but we know that the Scotsman's recently introduced a paywall. There's a paid subscription service there. How is that going? Do you expect to have to extend that to the Edinburgh Evening News, which doesn't have that paywall?
It's a good question. We have, it's going very well, particularly since the pandemic started. We've seen a much bigger uptake, perhaps partly because people aren't getting out to the supermarkets and the newsagents like they did. So they're paying online to get what they used to pay in the shops to get. Will we extend it to the evening news? We're going to have to. It's a question of when rather than if. Journalism costs money. Professional journalism is expensive. Even though I don't want to speak for all our colleagues. I don't think any of us are particularly well paid, extravagantly paid, but it's expensive employing people to fact check, to research, and people will have to pay for it or it won't be there.
Okay, here's some questions are coming in on the sidebar. So one from David Scott. Anyone just jump in to answer this. Has the loss of local identity and editorial content of the flagship titles, Scotsman, Herald, Courier, P&J, accelerated the decline of the Scottish debate? Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, the loss of identity of...
The loss of local identity and editorial content of the I guess you would say that probably hasn't happened, Euan, that there's still a good local flavour and local...
I'm interested in other views. I don't recognise that in... not just ours, but in any of the other local titles. I think there's huge amounts of original local Scottish journalism going into all our titles and all my colleagues here's titles as well.
Right. What about the impact of BBC Scotland? Much heralded, the introduction of the 9 and the new channel. Has that been a help or a hindrance to a thriving independent local media scene in Scotland?
For me, I think generally the BBC, I'm a fan of a lot of its output, a lot of its journalism, but it certainly makes life a lot more difficult to run Indigenous media in Scotland because there's this competition for audience. We need to get people to pay for our journalism or we can't carry on doing it. They're offering a lot for free. I think there's a case to be had to look at, the scope of what the BBC does and whether it needs to be doing local nostalgia features and things like that, which very much feel to me like the realm of my titles where we can help build an audience that.
David, did you have a perspective on that, and especially maybe mention the nature of your local democracy assignment, because I know it was partly funded by the BBC, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the BBC did fund it, and that is a big asset to local newspapers. And yeah, it was a fantastic thing they did. But notwithstanding that, there is a lot of things that the BBC doesn't help local media with. In the UK and Scotland, we don't really have a culture of people paying for news online, like in a lot of other countries in Europe. And that is largely down to the BBC's website having a monopoly and offering stuff for free. And a lot of the content is basically recycled from local news without acknowledgement. So there is still a big deficit there, I would say. And it is contributing to some of the problems in local media.
Does anyone want to defend the BBC, or are we unanimously saying that they're making life more difficult for the local press in Scotland?
I'm not going to say that they're making it more difficult. I do think it's probably, most people online, it's probably their, even though there are people who say they're for and against the BBC, it's probably a trusted source. It's a good place to start. But if you know, I know David and I have written stories and it's taken hours and you've had to, you know, do lots and lots of research about it. And then you go onto the BBC and they've got about 4 paragraphs about the same story. And we've all been at the same press you know, conference or whatever to hear about the story. But, you know, it's concise. That's not to say it's not without its problems. Of course it's not without its problems, but it has funded the Local Democracy Reporter scheme, which is a great thing, because you know, titles like the Scotsman, whoever, any JPI local title like the Falkirk Herald or the Bowness Journal and Gazette, which I've worked on, they can't afford to send journalists to council meetings, and that's what David did, and that was the gap that he plugged. So we can't be saying everything is bad about the BBC when they have fulfilled that role.
Okay, so Ed Jones is saying, I find Edinburgh newspapers far too uncritical of the powers that be. Would Phyllis Stephen and Euan McGrory tell us what proportion of their revenues come from local or national government?
You want to go first, Phyllis?
That's very easy. That's very easy. No, that's not true. We do get some very small pieces of advertising revenue from the City of Edinburgh Council. So, and it would be terrible of me not to say that is the case. But I am a member of the Independent Community News Network, and we have lobbied really hard there's about 8 or 10 members in Scotland to get a share of the Scottish Government's £3 million advertising campaign, which is apparently just about to start, but we still don't know whether we're getting any money or not. So I hope that answers your question.
Good.
Can I start by saying I'm very surprised to be accused of being uncritical. I don't know if there's anybody else in the audience who works at for the Scottish Government or the council or the health board or anywhere that would have a view on that. I'm regularly accused of being far too critical. I try and strike the right balance. But to answer the question about revenue, I don't know for sure. As far as I know, I think we get very little from the council. We are getting more from the Scottish Government at the moment for health message, public safety advertising, which makes the industry here one of the best supported in Europe, I have to say, with public funds, and that is partly down to the Scottish Government recognising that we can reach a lot of people that Google and Facebook can't necessarily do, but also that we've got a critical role to play, and that we deserve funded that way. So we do get extra revenue just now from them during the crisis. I don't know if that answers the question well enough. I'm happy to try again if not.
I think that's probably a good point for us to sort of turn to questions around the way the city is run. As journalists covering politics in Edinburgh and Scotland, of course, is there anything you would say that the city has done well over the past year, and what the main areas are for improvement? David, do you want to come in on that first?
If we're looking at the council's very good at sort of setting long-term sort of ambitious things, which are great for the city and they're fantastic. But I think a lot of people would probably agree there's a lot of day-to-day issues that maybe go unfunded or unnoticed. For example, around the corner for me, there is still a Christmas tree lying on the floor.
Is it yours?
It's not mine. But I think if you look at the pandemic, one of the fantastic things, if you can call anything coming out of this pandemic fantastic, was being able to move a lot of homeless people out of sort of substandard accommodation. Again, that's possibly a temporary measure though. But yeah, I think it's that focus on day-to-day stuff that really frustrates people, where there's a lot of visionary stuff which sounds great, but a long way down the line, a lot of people fail to sort of relate to it that easily.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Euan, do you have any sort of thoughts on this? Have you got any Christmas trees outside your flat, your house?
Yeah, I do recognise what David's saying about services. I'm sure he would agree with me as well that the local government generally is underfunded. So they've got a tough job that way. I guess that in terms of things that they do well, I've got two daughters who live in the city, and what life in the city will be like for them is really important to me. At the moment, we've got pre-pandemic, some of the record low unemployment, lots of fantastic opportunities to, whether that's jobs when they leave school, whether that's, creative things they can do, entertainment they can go to. It's a great place to live, and that doesn't happen by accident. Some of that is enabling work by the council. So I think we should recognise how well we're doing generally, and a lot of the things that we tend to report on, people complaining about, a lot of them I think are maybe problems of success. Rising house prices because people want to come and live here and work here, and tourism's been a hot topic, how to make that sustainable, again because so many people want to come here because it's a great place.
Yeah, absolutely. Mure, do you want to sort of come in? It'd be interesting to know from your perspective, having come from a slightly different, more international news context. Do you have any sort of thoughts on the way Edinburgh's being run sort of in the past year?
Well, I'm not sure exactly over the past year. I think I would echo partly what Euan is saying. I mean, in international terms, Edinburgh is an amazingly successful and relatively well-run place, and like every resident, I'd have a long list of things where I think the council should be doing better. Quite a few of those items would be just because it's not got enough money. Other items would be, probably arguable. But this is a well-run place, and it's in general, and it's a beautiful city which has managed to keep its beauty. And I think that's not just reflecting the council; it's reflecting people doing their best to protect it. There'd be questions in my mind about the way the council has been able to respond to some of the acute stresses of tourism, where you can have whole stairs full of Airbnb flats. It seems a problem that should be solvable, and where we have as you folks been involved in the very intense debates about development of things like the Royal High School, which is of international interest. I think people will look at that and wonder sometimes what Edinburgh is doing with its heritage. But overall, I would say this is a success story rather than anything else.
Lots of sort of positive things there. Phyllis, do you have anything negative to say, or are you going to echo these? No,
I think sometimes I do think people in the city don't really understand how much the council is actually responsible for. It's not just looking after your mother who needs to go into care, or your child who's at school, or picking up your bins, or whether you're a fan of the tram or not, doing the tram extension and digging up Leith Walk again. So I think there's a whole lot of stuff there that the council actually does do. And of course, part of the tourism thing, the Edinburgh Council were very much for the introduction of the tourist tax. Of course, they have said, yes, we want to be there, but they can't do anything about it till the Scottish government actually bring the legislation in. And I suppose because we're here in Edinburgh, sometimes the lines between who's doing what and who's responsible for what, sometimes that all gets fudged in a way. And I've had conversations with people about the Scottish government saying, oh, that tram thing, that was awful. Well, actually the Scottish government really weren't in favour of the tram at the very outset. And that's really where we all come in, is explaining and perhaps helping people to understand who is actually responsible for what, and therefore what they can do about it. Even today, the council were hearing from their head of finance that they have managed to get their revenue budget only within the last month or so under some form of control. Instead of having a £56 million gap in the revenue budget, it's down to 30. Well, that in a month or so is actually quite amazing. I don't know how they do that. Don't know which figures they add up to get that down. But that seems to me like some people in directors' positions at the council are hugely qualified and well able to do all those kind of things that are needed. It's a massive council with a massive staff, and they are employing, I think it's 20,000 people, isn't it, David? Something like that in the city. So they're a huge employer.
Excellent. So I guess one of the things that triggered this discussion was some commentary in the local press, especially in the Broughton Spurtle. The Broughton Spurtle is not with us tonight, but I know we're all avid readers, that during the pandemic, some perhaps decisions have been made which weren't scrutinized in the way that they may have been in normal times. So that really brings us on to one of the core questions we're considering tonight, that has local democracy been compromised due to the pandemic? What's the perspective of the panel? Let's maybe start with Mure.
I wouldn't want to comment too much on what's happening in Edinburgh, but I think it's absolutely the case that with the level of public attention and scrutiny and the particularly stretched resources of the press at every level, and this is not just about Scotland, it's not just about Edinburgh, but there's going to be a lot of bad stuff going on that we don't know about. And I think any pressure to make government at every level more transparent, to allow people and journalists to easily access the information they need to judge what councils or other levels of government are doing is really important.
David, do you have any perspective on that?
The circumstances we're living in, it's inevitable that will be an issue. The council seems to have been going onto an emergency footing to deal with a pandemic, and maybe a lot of the day-to-day aspects that people expect have maybe disappeared temporarily. Whether that's an intention, I doubt that's an intentional consequence of what we're living in. If you look at other councils' sort of reports and finances, Edinburgh's actually been one of the most transparent in how much money they are losing out during the pandemic. One of the only ones that has sort of itemised it and made public what sort of pressure they're under. And all councils are facing vast financial problems. So I don't think there's an intentional way to sort of avoid scrutiny, but I think just a consequence of the situation we're in at the moment.
Euan, how would you see that, the difference between the Scottish government and the city management during the pandemic? Do you think there's any differences there in terms of how transparent and how much scrutiny there's been on decision making?
I think there's been more obvious change in the city council, where they've been very explicit about streamlined decision making. So they've got an emergency kind of setup where a smaller number of people are making day-to-day decisions, and I can see the sense in that. I think most people would feel one of their frustrations is how, standing on the outside, how slow things seem to take to get things done at times. So we're still waiting for the public toilets to be opened up. Can that not be done quicker? So in terms of having a smaller executive team with more executive power who can make quick decisions on service delivery, I think is a good thing. Where I'm aware of more concerns is when that might impinge on things that are more a kind of planning development type thing. So I think most of the quasi-judicial role of the council is still being done in the same way, your planning applications and so on. But there's maybe a wee bit of a grey area with development of the street infrastructure and creating wider pavements and cutting down space for cars and so on. That has to be done quickly because we need more space for people to queue outside shops and making public realms safe. But I think there's some concern that maybe some things bigger, more infrastructure-wise, might come through under those executive powers without the same level of scrutiny.
It's clear that the council's long-term vision, is to reduce car use in the city, for example, and there's no doubt that they've moved quickly to close off some of the streets in the city centre, which many of us would think is a good thing. But Phyllis, do you think they've moved too quickly, or do you think there's been sufficient time for residents and for the people that you're close to in terms of your day-to-day reporting to give their points of view?
Well, I've been on the street with the transport convener. I was on the street with her up in Braidburn Terrace when they had literally just closed Braid Road, and then they had to make Braidburn Terrace one way. And she's pretty good at dealing with the public and dealing with things. But the whole thing now, we've moved on from just closing streets, because now we've got Links Gardens, Silverknowes Road, all these various streets around the city closed to traffic, but open to people for walking and cycling and wheeling, which is, that has to be a good thing. But I don't think there's very much transparency now in relation to what the next set of plans will be. And those are things like Morningside, for example, where you have narrowish pavements, you have cars parked, and then you have two sets of traffic passing each other. You have to do something about that, because otherwise nobody's going to be able to go there and walk about and shop and queue and do everything like that they need to do in our post-pandemic world. They're not going to be able to do those things safely. And there doesn't seem to me to be very much transparency about what the plans are, nor indeed is there a sufficient level of detail as to what the plans are. We've got this, it's called Common Spaces, I think that's Common Spaces, where you can go on and you can comment on things in your area and what you would like to see. And yes, you're very right, Nick, in saying that the council has a long-term vision and has had it for a long time now, since probably the last administration, or even perhaps since David Begg's time, if anybody can remember him as transport convener, that, cars are not really wanted in the city centre, and there's good reason for that, and that's because there's a climate crisis. It's not really just about the council just wanting to get rid of the bad car. And then you end up, of course, as we all know, with polarizing opposite views. You have the pro-cycling lobby who will say that a cyclist will stop and will spend much more in a shop. And then you have somebody who says, I can't go and do my shopping unless I have my car. So it is a bit of a no-win situation. But I do think they need to have a little more transparency on all of those things. There is a much shorter consultation period with community councils and everything. It's up to 5 days, and then they can just roll out a temporary traffic regulation order, which normally would take 2 to 3 years.
Just a few questions coming in here. One from Denzel Skinner. Just jump in, anyone, to answer this. At present, do you believe the political balance within the council results in the councillors acting politically or in the best interest of the wider city? Anyone have a point of view on that? Obviously, we're in a minority administration, Labour SNP. How does that affect things?
It reflects the will of the people, doesn't it? The people voted for them.
I'd be interested what Phyllis and David think, but one observation I would make is the last small number of years, I think the city council, like the rest of society has become far more party political and far more party political antagonistic than it's ever been. And there's a tradition many years ago where local authorities were, much more independent and not party political. I think that's changed a lot, but I don't think that's peculiar to Edinburgh Council at all.
Right.
Yeah, I would say it is very political. Even the SNP Labour coalition, a lot of them, I don't even see eye to eye. So there is a sort of infighting and in politics going on. But a benefit of having a minority administration is also that the administration need support to get things through. So they have to compromise, and sort of the Greens and the Lib Dems often get some parts of what they would like incorporated. So that in a way is quite a healthy situation, that the administration have to sort of be able to compromise in order to get things done.
Mure, is that something you've seen internationally in other cities where you have minority administrations and a lot of compromise and deal making has to happen at a local level?
Well, it's very difficult. The cities that I've been lucky enough to cover, it's difficult to find parallels. For example, Beijing, it's very much a one-party administration in Beijing. And sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. So Beijing city development has been extraordinarily bold, extraordinarily ambitious. When I first went in 1989, it was a city that kind of went to sleep at 7 o'clock at night. There wasn't even street lighting on most streets. It was dirty, dangerous, and unpleasant in large parts of it. And now it's it's got one of the biggest underground systems in the world. It's got huge expanses of new housing. And yet, I think people in centuries to come in Beijing will deeply regret the destruction of the original fabric of the city, which was distinctive and beautiful. And, it made me, seeing that fabric destroyed in the years that I spent there in the 90s and the 2000s, made me really appreciate the otherwise sometimes unpleasant kind of conservatism with a small c of Edinburgh. So come back to the politics. I mean, people are always wanting politicians to behave less politically, and I think they should. When you're elected, you should take a different view of your responsibilities as a politician. But we as voters, we have to be more engaged and judge our politicians better. It's our responsibility. We shouldn't just always complain about the politicians we get. And maybe finally on that, I don't know what other people think about it, but I was not very impressed by the voting system, the multi-member wards in Edinburgh. It seems very clear who's going to win election in my ward, certainly. And I wonder if that reduces the competition among politicians to appeal to a wider electorate, or is it not just enough to sort of be big enough to lock in your own party's votes?
Yeah.
I think it's been quite common in the Q&A that we've seen so far. We've got quite a lot of comments and questions on something that's come up from a few of you now. New developments in Edinburgh is obviously a very controversial topic, and it's where we certainly see very high levels of passion and frustration from people. So moving on to that topic that you've touched on a little bit, what is going wrong here for the city? Are there any solutions that you see? What can the city do better in that respect? Anyone in particular have any burning thoughts they want to jump in with?
So we can start by saying that the Edinburgh World Heritage stoked the fire of controversy then. I think you're a very good conduit for many of the local issues, but people in Edinburgh are very fond of their city, and they're very much engaged in retaining things as is a lot of the time. And of course we can't stand still because we've got to be a modern city and move on. It would be lovely to see whatever it could be up at Royal High School. It would be absolutely fabulous to see something down, even having started, down in Princes Street Gardens. If enough people could just agree that that had some legs as a development. And then on the other hand, you get things like Save Leith Walk, where people actually did manage to save a 2-story red sandstone building, which now only has a pub left in it. All the other tenants have been kicked out by the owner. And so, you know, and is that a good thing? Was it important enough? And, you know, I think there are some people who certainly question it, but what you cannot question is the local people and their complete fervor in guarding it and keeping it there.
Euan, do you have any thoughts there?
I was going to ask Mure a question. One of the things I hear a lot is from business and development side, people say it's really hard to get anything done in Edinburgh. It takes far too long. We're putting international investment at risk because it's too difficult. But obviously, you've got that competing need to protect the fantastic city and heritage we've got. You know, why do people want to come and live and work and invest in Edinburgh? Largely because it's a beautiful city. And I wondered, Mure, I was particularly interested when you were talking about China and how they destroyed a lot of old heritage. What your perspective was on that whole argument. It's a constant tension in Edinburgh. I don't know if we got the balance right or not. I think it probably should, you know, always be a tension. But I'd be very interested in your perspective on it.
It's a really interesting. But there is no simple answer. But my personal view would be that Edinburgh should err on the side of caution when it comes to doing anything that affects its existing, particularly its historic fabric. I mean, I think that's in a world in which having a distinctive edge in any area is really valuable. Edinburgh has a very powerful brand. It's got a real distinctive appeal, and I would say, you know, the native caution of Edinburgh people when it comes to changing that is probably a good idea. Now, obviously, within that, you should make it as easy as possible for people to do business, because we need to have business and we need to develop. But there are usually ways to do things, and you shouldn't just roll over the first time a property developer wants you to. One thing I find, disappointing about Edinburgh since coming back is that we haven't sought to make new construction in areas outside the heritage area, the heritage area, more distinctive. I mean, we've just sort of settled for nods in the direction of a kind of Edinburgh style, a bit of sandstone here and there, or maybe a bit of sort of Scandinavian wood and stuff. But there hasn't been an effort to establish an aesthetic for all of these new housing schemes, which are covering large parts of our city. And it's not too late for our politicians and planners, if they're watching, to say, well, for Edinburgh to be continuing to be distinctive and special in the world, maybe we should try and have a more distinctive design of the new buildings that we allow.
I think that's a good point.
Echo with the. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think a lot of our readers would absolutely echo that. I can think of lots of headlines we've had about Soviet-style blocks and things like that. I think, a lot of people would agree with that.
I think that's also the ambition. Phyllis, you may have a perspective on this. For the city plan, is for a sustainable and diverse and distinctive city outside of the centre as well. As well as enlarging the tourist footprint to be larger, because we do suffer from a particularly concentrated footprint of certain areas of the city, and cities like Amsterdam probably do a better job in broadening that, having more interesting suburbs and also broadening the appeal of the city. Yeah,
that's true. But going slightly back to the local democracy and our local council here, one of the committees which they've definitely had running is the planning committee, and I know this to my cost because the planning convener pulled me up about it, and we recorded a podcast with him to make up for it so that he could have his say. And definitely they are there and they are still taking decisions, and the whole reason for that is to say Edinburgh is open for business and we want people to come and do things. And of course that wasn't to stop, however, a decision made just last week where they refused a second application for permission from Lidl. And principally it was because it's a food use and it's down in Seafield, and the reason is that it doesn't fit. It's called an out-of-town site, Seafields, that's a planning term. So they're very big on looking at their local development plan, yes, and trying to, you know, obviously stick within it, otherwise people will just appeal planning permission. But an awful lot of this desire to have lovely houses in certain areas, etc., well, it costs money, and any property developer, I'm sure, would tell you that.
Phyllis, do you want to talk
a little bit, maybe, Phyllis, that it seems to me that, you know, we have, for example, down close to the block that you pointed out was saved, and to me also a fairly undistinguished block, but near there's lots of construction that's happened. But it's in these sort of chunks of different aesthetic, which don't support each other. And the original Newtown genius was that the original buildings weren't terribly distinctive, but together they created a harmony and a sort of overall aesthetic impact that the buildings couldn't possibly have had on their own. And we don't seem to have anything like that kind of vision when it comes to these new houses. I can't imagine it would cost that much more
just to make it look nice.
More visionary design planners and architects.
Right, we've still got a few more minutes, so please keep your questions coming. We've got a question here from Anonymous. Will the loss of Marketing Edinburgh be a positive or a negative for the city? Who wants to jump in on that? Most cities of Edinburgh scale do have some sort of destination marketing organisation, something that the council has recently cut.
I think Edinburgh as a city doesn't want to abdicate responsibility for it to, you know, a national level. Otherwise, I think Edinburgh's interests miss out. Short answer. There's a lot more I could say. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
I've written quite a lot about, sorry David, I've written quite a lot about this, and there's been a lot of council money spent on hibernating the body that was, or is still, but it's not working. In Marketing Edinburgh, they spent about 1.2 million or so on hibernating it. And it is clear that now in post-pandemic days, we will definitely need somebody with marketing skills to market our city. It doesn't sell itself.
Well, the world's changed, as we all know, dramatically in the last 3 months. They've made the same decision now. I think it seems madness, doesn't it, when you look back?
Question, just getting back to social media for a moment, question from Stefano Smith. What is the panel's view of the use of social media sites as a source of news? 45% of Facebook users derive their news from the site. What is the quality of this news?
Highly variable.
Debatable.
A lot of what you read, the news you read on Facebook, of course, comes from Mure and Phyllis and David and I and our colleagues. So there's a lot of stuff that you get through social media that comes from trusted sources, but a lot of it isn't. So I think what the original source of it is really important, because there's a lot of poison and danger and misinformation.
So Phyllis, maybe you could comment on that, especially from your unique experience of having established a successful local media title in the last few years. Do you see the Facebooks of this world as a threat to local democracy, community?
Yes, they are, in as much as what Euan has said is quite correct. There's an awful lot of misinformation, but if with a little bit of guidance and help, you can actually get rid of the misinformation in your own Facebook feed or whatever. But the other part of all of that is that these are the companies with huge amounts of money, and they might yet be our saviors in the provision of news in any form. I know there's a Facebook initiative, and I know the Google News initiative has pumped hundreds of thousands of pounds into titles here in Scotland. So they might yet save us from wherever we're all heading.
There's some interesting things going on, isn't there? They need to do a heck of a lot more if they're going to be saviours in any way, aren't they? They make so much money off our backs.
Yeah, right.
So I think we should be cautious about a future in which large American companies are all that keeps Scottish press from disaster. We need to find other models, and that's a real challenge. But we in the press, the FT is in a very lucky position because it has a global reach and an audience that's used to paying quite a lot for it. So our subscriber base is easier to tap than it is for most news. But it's in all of our interest to have news coming from sources that we can identify that will still be there if we need to sue them, and that there's a plurality. They're not all from one kind of proprietor, and that's important for all of us at every level of democracy.
Would you support, with the French government, I think, gives tokens to young people to get a free newspaper so they can start to get in the habit of reading the Figaro and Le Monde. Is that something we should consider in the UK or in Scotland?
Yeah, that's in the Cairncross review, isn't it? Isn't there something like that? And Francis Cairncross just brought out a huge review lauding the local democracy reporting scheme and saying it should be extended, and also setting ground rules for a news foundation and things like that. So there's lots and lots of different things being looked at.
And we do, I think, brings us back to some of the stuff we were talking about at the start. We do need thriving local media. And if you took the evening news out of Edinburgh, for instance, you've instantly got about 80,000 people who every day are reading about what is going on in Edinburgh. A lot of what they're reading about is what's going on in the local council, the health service, and so on. So politics in the broadest sense. If it's a dramatic scenario, but if we weren't able to find a way to sufficiently fund our journalism and we vanished overnight, I think it's something that is worth pausing to think about. The disengagements in civic society suddenly is huge. Who knows what the council's doing and how they're doing it in those circumstances.
Exactly.
I think as we get close to 7 p.m, we're going to hopefully close on a positive note from all of you. We'd like to know what the biggest positive outcome of the lockdown situation, if we're able to identify one, could be, as we're starting to look ahead to easing some of the restrictions in the sort of coming summer months. David, I don't know if you want to start us off there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to find a positive in such a horrible situation. From the industry's point of view, I guess, there's been a lot of news, to put it quite bluntly, and people have come more, bigger audiences have been built to news. So we just have to hope that they come back and we get to some sort of normality, and we have shown that we can be trusted to report on these really important issues. That if people want to press, then they need to support us by buying a paper and subscribing.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully people will be looking forward to that time when they can pop out on a Sunday and pick up their papers in person. It'll be without having to queue, maybe. Phyllis,
yeah, I think that's right. I think, the subscription model, we've introduced a subscription model. We always have a place where people can buy us a cup of coffee or anything like that. And loads of people have. During this pandemic, it's been great. But I think if you're looking for something out of the pandemic, I've been accused of being an optimist. I saw somebody flash up with something saying I was an optimist, but I am, and I make no bones about that. But the stories we've covered about volunteers and people feeding people who are desperately in need. The volunteers are people on furlough or just youth workers or whatever, and those people have just raised my spirits every time I've gone out to meet them at a distance, of course.
Empty Kitchens, Full Hearts has been reported on recently, hasn't it? And that's been particularly inspiring. Euan?
I think that there's one big positive that the engagement with local journalism has been enormous. I can't answer all the messages I'm getting. It was hard in normal times in the pandemic. Me and my staff cannot keep up with the number of people who either are turning to us for help or are wanting to tell inspiring stories. We've got the biggest audiences that Scotsman and the Evening News have had in, for the Scotsman's case, more than 200 years. Right now, we've got far more people reading our journalism at any point in our history. We just need to find a way to make enough money off that to pay for our journalists.
Absolutely, yeah, that's fantastic. Mure, final thoughts from you, please.
I wouldn't disagree with anything I've just heard there, but maybe when we have a crisis like this and a grim situation like this, it makes us think about what really matters to us. And I think that should have implications for how we come out of the crisis and what we put most of our effort and our resources into. And so, one of the things the really big crisis of our time is probably climate change. It's not the coronavirus. So as now we've had this reminder of how fragile our usual ways of living and working are, maybe we can have more ambition or more imagination about how we change our ways of living to deal with this much more existential crisis of climate. And the same for us in the media. We have to be ready to change the way we work. And we have to hope that if we do work that is of value, that people will value it. And then it's just a matter of finding a business model.
Very good. Thank you all very much. So I thought that was a great conversation, tremendous insights, tremendous honesty, very balanced comments. I think if anyone was listening in from CEC or from Scottish Government, I think everyone would agree that that was a very good, balanced and objective assessment of where we are today from the point of view of local democracy and of the press. So thank you very much, Phyllis and Mure and David and Euan. You've also helped raise a little bit of money for Edinburgh World Heritage. So thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening for their contributions. That will certainly help to plugging the gap. And just over to Becky for a last few comments.
Yeah, so anybody who hasn't yet donated, a quick reminder for you. You can text the word Edinburgh WH with the amount you want to donate to 70450. So if you'd like to donate £10, for example, then text Edinburgh WH10 to 70450. That's Edinburgh WH10 to 70450. And as we said at the beginning, if you would like to become a member and support our conservation work in the city, please go to the members section of our website, ewh.org.uk.
And we have another event coming up. So just for everyone, is July the 16th, Becky, yeah?
Yes.
July the 16th, we have an evening. It's entitled Black History Matters. And we will be enjoying conversation with Sir Jeff Palmer and a number of other experts and members of the BAME community, discussing some of the issues around Edinburgh's Black history. So we hope very much that everyone will be able to join us for that. And in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.